Hello and welcome to another Warlords of Draenor video. This time it's going to be taking a look at the preliminary versions of the level 100 talents. Overall they look quite cool and yeah, let's jump into it. So first of all, let's go with the plate classes. So for Warrior, the first one is Blade Barrier. It's a passive, and whenever you Whirlwind or Thunderclap, whirling blades continue to spin around you for 30 seconds, doing 1000 damage every second to all enemies within 8 yards. Also, it's probably worth mentioning that because of the item squish, some of these numbers may seem a little bit odd, so just take that with a grain of salt, I suppose. The next one is Ravager. This is a 40 yard range with a 0.879 second cast and a 1 minute cooldown. It throws a whirling axe at the target location, doing 3000 damage to enemies within 8 yards every 1 second, lasting 15 seconds. The next is Extreme Measures, and for Arms and Fury, it's an instant that does damage to yourself equal to 20% of your maximum health but gives you 30 rage. And for Protection, it's an instant with a 1.5 second cooldown, which is it says here, a dauntless combat stance that increases all damage dealt by 20%. It also causes Shield Slam to consume Shield Barrier as additional damage and has an increased critical chance, which is equal to your critical block chance. So essentially it is making Protection Warriors do more damage per second. I think that's actually really kind of cool. So next we have Death Knights. Their first one is Necrotic Plague. This is a passive, which is a disease that does 100 damage per stack every 3 seconds or 30 seconds, and each time it deals damage it gains 1 stack and jumps to a nearby enemy if possible, and it cannot be spread by pestilence. It replaces Blood Plague. The next is Defile. This costs 1 Unholy Rune and it's a 30 yard range. It's an instant with a 30 second cooldown that defiles the ground targeted by the Death Knight, causing 100 shadow damage every second for 10 seconds, and each time Defile deals damage, it increases in area and damage by 5%, and it can grow a maximum of 3 times per second, and it replaces Death and Decay. The next is the Breath of Sindragosa. It's 15 runic power and 15 per second. It's an instant with a 1 minute cooldown that does a continuous 2000 Shadow Frost damage every 1 second in a cone in front of you. So there we go. Let's move on to the Paladins. So the Paladin ones are very complex. First of all, we have the Light Within. For Holy, this is a beacon of light that can now be placed on 2 targets. For Protection and Retribution, it gives you Empowered Seals. This is a passive, meaning that your seals can cause your judgment to empower you with an additional beneficial effect. So for Justice, it's increased movement speed of 10% for 20 seconds. For Insight, it's 3% heal every 2 seconds for 20 seconds. For Righteousness, it's attack speed of 10% buff for 20 seconds. And for Truth, it is attack power by 10% for 20 seconds. For the next one is called Seal of Faith. This costs 623 mana. It's an instant which fills you with holy light, causing you to gain faith equal to all damage dealt. Faith acts as spell power towards the next healing spell you cast. So for holy, while Seal of Faith is active, all damage dealt is increased by 30%. For Protection and Retribution, it says here all damage dealt is reduced by 30%. It's kind of interesting. The next one is called Divine Consecration. For Holy, it gives you Served by the Light. This is a passive, and whenever your Beacon of Light target drops below 30% health, you instantly grant the injured target a protective shield, absorbing up to 30% of their maximum health every 10 seconds, and you cannot shield the same person this way twice within 60 seconds. For Protection, it gives you Holy Shield, which increases your block chance by 10% when you block, and does 2000 holy damage to your attacker. It is a passive. And finally, for Retribution, you get Final Verdict. This costs 3 holy power and requires you to be in melee range. It's an instant that empowers your weapon with holy energy, performing a devastating strike, doing 250% weapon damage as holy, and it replaces Templar's Verdict. Oh, this is all a mouthful, isn't it? Next we have Hunters. The first one is Bola Shot. It's 30 focus and 40 yard range. It's an instant which fires a bola at your target, which wraps around them, and after 1 second explodes, doing 3000 fire damage and an additional 2000 fire damage to all enemies within 5 yards. It replaces Arcane Shot. Next we have Snipe, which is 40 yard range and a 2.77 second cast. It carefully lines up the perfect shot, dealing 100% weapon damage and generating you 60 focus. It can't be done while moving, and it replaces Steady Shot and Cobra Shot. And for Beastmaster and Survival, this will also refresh Serpent Sting, and for Marksmanship, it will also trigger Steady Focus. The next one is called With or Without You. which I'm pretty sure is the name of a song. Yeah, for Beast Mastery, this is a passive which increases the effect of your pet's combat experience by to 70% increased damage, and your pet also gains the following abilities regardless of spec, which is Rabid, Spiked Collar, Thunderstomp, Blood of the Rhino, Great Stamina, Bullheaded, Cornered, and Boar Speed. Basically, it buffs the hell out of your pet. The next one is called Lone Wolf, and it's for Marksmanship and Survival. It's a passive that increases all damage dealt by 30% while you don't have an active pet. That's really interesting to me. So let's move on to Shamans. So the first one is called Rainstorm. For Elemental and Enhancement, it gives you Storm Armor. This is a passive whenever your Lightning Shield is active. The lightning will strike a random enemy within 40 yards and do 2,000 nature damage every 3 seconds. For Restoration, it costs 100 mana and will give you a Condensation Totem. This summons a water totem with 5 health at the feet of the caster, which collects 25% of all overhealing and grants it to the shaman as spells power towards their next Healing Wave, Healing Surge, Greater Healing Wave, Chain Heal, or Riptide. The next one is called Storm Elemental Totem. This costs 1,022 mana. It's a 5-minute cooldown, and it summons an air totem with 6,000 health at the feet of the caster, which calls forth a Greater Storm Elemental to hurl gusts of wind at the caster's enemies. Each gust does damage to the enemy and heals all allies within 15 yards for 100% of the damage dealt, split evenly, and it lasts until cancelled. Finally, we have Reach of the Elements. This is for, it gives you Spew Lava if you're Elemental or Enhancement, which is a 40-yard range. It's an instant with a 45-second cooldown, and it empowers your current fire totem with the power of lava, causing it to spew globs of lava at a random enemy within 40 yards every 1 second for 15 seconds. Each glob will do 2,000 fire damage to all enemies within 8 yards. And finally, this will give you, if you're Restoration, High Tide, which is a passive that means your Chain Heal also bounces to all targets affected by your Riptide. So now that the male people are done, let's move on to the, not the male people, the leather ones, that's it. So, Druids. The first one's called Touch of a Loon. If you're balanced, this will mean that entering Solar Eclipse will transform your Starfall into a Sunfall and reset its cooldown. If you're Feral, then your Moonfire will is now unstable while in cat form. Usable in cat form. It gives you 1 combo point and costs 30 energy. And if you're Guardian, it is a instant 1.5 second cooldown that requires bear form that converts up to 60 rage into 5,000 absorption for 15 seconds, and it replaces Frenzied Regeneration. Finally, for Restoration, this will mean that your Omen of Clarity now lasts 5 seconds instead of 1 cast. Next, we have the Will of Malfurion. This, for balance, gives you Zenith. This is a channeled spell which targets all enemies within 60 yards and accelerates the caster's Moonfire and Sunfire effects, causing them to deal damage equal to at 400% of the normal rate for 4 seconds. Next, for Feral, you get Bloody Thrash. This is a passive, which means your Thrash also spreads Rake to other damaged enemies. For Guardian, you get Malfurion's Tenacity, which is a passive that increases armor by 200% of your agility. For Restoration, you get Germination. This is a passive, which means that Genesis also extends Rejuvenation by 1 second after hastening it. And finally, you get Might of Malorn. You can choose Might of Malorn. For balance, this gives you Equinox. This is a passive, which means that Lunar and Solar Eclipse now last until the other is triggered, instead of ending at 0 balance power. For Feral, you get Savagery, which means that Savage Roar is now passive. For Guardian, you get Bristling Fur. This is a passive, which means that until you use Enrage, the next attack against you will deal 50% less damage. After you use Enrage. And Restoration gives you Rampant Growth, which will cause your Swiftmen to consume a regrowth or rejuvenation, but have no cooldown. Interesting stuff. Now that the Druid's on, let's move on to the Monk. There's quite a lot for the monks. So the first one's called Vital Conviction. For Brewmaster, this gives you Soul Dance. This is a passive, and it says that you are now able to shrug off even spells, such that 30% of your normal stagger amount works against magic damage. Not exactly sure what that means. The next one is Detonate Chief for Mistweavers. This will give you 1,000 mana. This costs 1,000 mana and has a 100-yard range. It's an instant that causes your healing spheres to instantly trigger, healing the nearest ally within 6 yards. For Windwaker, you get Windwalker. It's a 15-yard range, which is an instant with a 45-second cooldown, and it unleashes a series of rapid kicks, dashing between nearby targets, dealing 14,000 damage over 3 seconds. While kicking, you are immune to all damage and effects. The next one is called Chi Explosion. This costs 1 Chi and has a 40-yard range. It's an instant that consumes up to 4 Chi to cause the enemy target to explode with Chi energy, doing additional effects based on the Chi consumed. So for Brewmaster, if you have 1 plus Chi, it will deal 2,500 nature damage. If you have 2 plus, it will give you Shuffle for 6 seconds. If it's 3 plus, it purifies all your staggered damage. If it's 4 plus, then the damage also hits all enemies within 8 yards of the target. For Mistweaver, it will heal an ally by 2,500, and the healing will also, if it's 2 plus, it will heal all allies within 8 yards of the target for that healing. If it's 3 plus, it will summon 8 healing spheres within an 8-yard radius ring around the target. And if you have 4 plus Chi, it will make your healed allies also be healed for an additional 800 over 6 seconds. Finally, for Windwalkers, if you have 1 Chi, it will do 2,500 nature damage to an enemy. If you have 2 plus, it will make it so that your damaged enemies now take an additional 1,500 nature damage over 6 seconds. If you're 3 plus Chi, it will generate a charge of Tiger Eye Brew, and if you're 4 plus Chi, it will mean the damage also hits all enemies within 8 yards of the target. And finally, we have Serene Mists. For Brewmaster and Windwalker, you get Chi Serenity. This is an instant with a 1.5 second cooldown, and you enter a state of physical and mental serenity for 10 seconds, and while you're in this state, all Chi consumptions are instantaneously refilled. For Mistweaver, you will get Soothing Tendrils. This is a passive. Your Soothing Mists now also chain up to 2 additional allies within 15 yards of the last ally, and has a 50% higher chance to generate Chi. And finally, for the leather-wearing classes, let's cover the Rogue. The first one's called the Master of Basics. It's a passive, and it means that whenever you critically strike with an auto attack, you gain an additional combo point on your target. The next one is called Shadow Reflection. This is a 20-yard range. It's an instant with a 2-minute cooldown, and you summon a shadow of yourself on the target, which will match and memorize your ability usage for the next 8 seconds. After this time, the Mimic will use the memorized abilities on your target over the next 8 seconds. I'm not too sure if that's 100% damage or not. The next one's Death from Above. It's 50 energy. It's an instant with a 20-second cooldown that requires a one-handed melee weapon. It's a finishing move that consumes combo points on the target to empower your weapons with shadow energy to perform a devastating 2-part attack. You whirl around dealing shadow damage to all enemies within 8 yards, and then leap in the air and slice onto your target on the way back down, dealing additional shadow damage. So if you have 1 point, you will do 400 area damage on 1,000 target. If you have 2 points, it will be 800 area and 2,000 target. If you have 3 points, it will be 1,200 area, 3,000 target. If you have 4 points, it will be 1,600 area, 4,000 target. And if you have 5 points, it will be 2,000 area and 5,000 target. Now let's finish this off with the Clothies. So, the Mage. Well, your first one's called Prolonged Exposure. For Arcane, it will mean that casting Arcane Missiles extends Arcane power by 2 seconds. For Fire, it means that your Fireball, Pyroblast, and Inferno Blast critical strikes extend combustion by 1 second. And for Frost, it means that your Ice Lance extends Icy Veins by 2 seconds. For the next one, it's called Focusing Crystal. It's a 40-yard range, it's an instant with a 1-minute cooldown. Conjuring a focusing crystal, it conjures a focusing crystal at the target's location, which is attackable only by the mage. The crystal will absorb the power of all damage dealt to it, and after 10 seconds it will release a burst of energy, dealing damage to 130%, equal to 130% of the damage it took, split between all enemies within 8 yards over 6 seconds. The next one is called Falling Stars. For Arcane, it gives you an Arcane Orb. It's an instant 15 second, and it launches an Arcane Orb from the Mage's location, travelling up to 40 yards, dealing 1,000 Arcane damage to enemies that it passes through, and giving the Mage a Arcane Charge every time it deals damage. Next one is for Fire. It's called Meteor. It costs 1,000 mana, 40-yard range. It's instant with a 45-second cooldown. It calls down a meteor which lands on the target location after 3 seconds, dealing 10,000 fire damage, split evenly between all targets within 8 yards. It also burns the ground, doing an additional 2,000 fire damage over 10 seconds to all enemies in the area. And finally, for Frost, this will do Comet Storm. This is 1,000 mana, 40-yard range, instant with a 30-second cooldown, and it calls down a series of 7 icy comets on or around the target area, each of which do 2,000 damage, split between all enemies within 5 yards of its impact point. Next, let's talk about the Priest. So the first one is Divine Clarity. If you are disciplined, this gives you Clarity of Will. This is 1,000 mana, 40-yard range, 2.5 second cast. It shields the target with a protective ward, absorbing up to 2,500 damage within 30 seconds, and it replaces Greater Heal. For Holy, you get Clarity of Purpose. This is 1000 mana and a 40-yard range. It's a 2.5 second cast that will heal allies within 10 yards of the target for 5000 damage, split so that the more injured targets will receive a larger portion of the healing, and it replaces Greater Heal. For Shadow, you get Clarity of Power. This is a passive. Your direct shadow damage spells deal 40% additional damage to targets not affected by your periodic damage spells. Casting Mind Spike will also reduce the cooldown of Mind Blast by 1 second. Shadowy Recall now also affects your direct damage spells. The next one's Power of the Void. For Discipline and Holy, it gives you shifting perspectives, which causes your Void Shift to have no cooldowns, but it can only be cast on allies with less health than you, and also no longer heals. For Shadow, you get Void Energy. This means that all Shadow Orbs in a 40-yard range, well, it says here, all Shadow Orbs, 40-yard range, 1.5 second cast, and what it does is, yes, it consumes up to 3 Shadow Orbs and deals 750 damage every 3 seconds for 30 seconds. Next, we have Spiritual Guidance. For Discipline and Holy, this gives you Saving Grace, which is 3000 mana, 40-yard range, and it's instant. It instantly heals a friendly target for 50% maximum health, and reduces your healing done by 10% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 10 times. And finally, for Shadow, we have a passive called, Auspicious Spirits, and it means that your shadowy apparitions give you 1 Shadow Orb whenever they deal damage. And finally, to round off this video, let's talk about the Warlock. They have Chaotic Resources. For Affliction, this gives you Soulburn Haunt. This is a passive which grants the Soulburn empowerment of your Haunt spell, and your Haunt will also give you 15% increased periodic damage for 30 seconds. For Demonology, you get Furious Chaos. This is a passive which means that your Touch of Chaos no longer costs Demonic Fury, and instead generates 40 Demonic Fury, but Metamorphosis provides 30% less increased damage. For Destruction, you get Charred Remains. This is a passive, and your Incinerate and Conflagate deal 75% less damage, but they generate 400% more Burning Embers. The next one's called Cataclysm. This is a 40-yard range, 2.6 second cast with a 1 minute cooldown, and it conjures a Cataclysm at the target location, dealing 10,000 Shadow Flame damage to all enemies within 8 yards. For Affliction and Demonology, it will also apply Corruption, and for Destruction, it will also apply Immolate. And finally, for the last one, it's Demonic Servitude. This is a passive, and it says that you are now able to maintain control over even greater minions indefinitely, enabling you to summon permanent Doom Guards and Infernals. Oh my god, that was really hard to commentate, but thank god it's done. Holy crap. Well, there you go. I hope you found that useful in some regard. Do bear in mind that these are all subject to change. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'm going to have a cup of tea to recover from commentating that, and I'll see you on the next BlizzCon video.